Today's video is going to focus on a practical but still pleasant binding called a stiffened paper binding. I'll be following instructions by Peter Verheyen in the German Stiffened Paper Binding website, or Steifbroschuren. However, it's not just the German tradition that uses this binding technique. As you can see here, William Matthews' book on simple bookbinding for junior schools is done this way, and you couldn't get more English than this book. To demonstrate, I'm going to use 4 books I've downloaded from the internet by John Plager on bookbinding. He was an American bookbinder from the first half of the 20th century. The third volume was quite large, so I split that into 2 parts, so we end up with 5 books. I'll also show a 6th book to demonstrate a variation with the fore-edge square. All the other variations we'll look at are trimmed flush at the fore-edge. I'll demonstrate the 3 end paper configurations that Peter describes. I'll do the tipped-on sheet around the first and last section, a tipped-on folio, and a hooked folio. So I'll start by folding the sections. So I've printed out the sections in the way that I describe in my last video on going from a PDF to printed sections. Now, binding 6 books, there is a fair bit of repetition. Now, I'm not going to show you me folding the total of almost 50 sections. However, I will show enough to demonstrate that there is a fair bit of repetition often in bookbinding. I do find a lot of beginners are surprised by this. The idea of sewing a book with 30 plus sections, they're horrified because their sewing may be still a bit slow, but they're just the realities of bookbinding. So I don't want to cut out all the repetition and make it look like it takes 5 minutes to sew 6 books. I do want to capture the time that it takes in some way, but at the same time I don't want the video to be boring. So I've folded all the books, and now I'm going to press them overnight to get the air out of the sections. In addition to the 3 end paper configurations, I'm going to demonstrate 4 different sewing approaches. So I'll do all along sewing supported on tapes, what's commonly known as French sewing, and then French sewing supported on tapes. Now, all of these sewing configurations can use the same hole punching pattern. So I'm just going to make a hole punching template, and I'm just going to use a very common, I think it's a 13mm cotton tape. Now, I would normally use Rami band because it's thinner and won't show up around the spine, but I wanted to use a material that's more commonly available. So this is a very standard cotton tape, but you'll see it hardly shows up at all on the spine. So it's a perfectly acceptable tape to use. So now I'll start the punching. Now I won't do all of them to start with. We'll start with the first book. So the first book is just going to be all along sewing, no support. For this first example, I'm going to tip on folios for the end papers, and then I will move on to the next book. So I'll get all the books up to the point where we glue the spines, and then we'll do the attach the boards and then cover the spine and then apply the covering material. tip on folios of coloured paper at the front and back of the book. Now, I just assume by this point in my video series that everyone knows that I always use paper with the grain running head to tail. If you're not familiar with what that is, I've got a video about paper grain direction, but we definitely want the paper grain direction running vertically in the book, because we are going to apply adhesive to the outer sheet and use that to attach the board, and we don't want that pulling from the tail and top of the book and warping the boards. So I'm just going to put a bit of light pressure on those and start the second book. In this second book, I'm going to hook on single sheets of coloured paper on the first and last sections. So I need to do that before we punch the holes and sew the book. Now, I like to apply the adhesive to both the section and the end papers just to make sure that there's really good adhesion. So I'll apply the adhesive, bring the two together, let them set for a minute or so, and then fold them around. I'll trim off excess paper just so that it doesn't get in the way later. I'll punch the holes and then we'll do the second sewing configuration. For this second book, we're also going to do all along sewing. However, it's going to be supported on cotton tapes. Now, for some people, all along sewing means to sew around the tapes so that you get a continuous line of thread on the inside of the section, or most often it's for sewn on end papers. However, it's also commonly used for this type of sewing, so it's sort of interchangeable. That's book number 2 done. Now 3 and 4 we're going to do French sewing and then French sewing over tapes, and I'm just going to tip on folios for end papers. So I'm just going to go ahead and punch the holes for both the 3rd and 4th books. Now, I've demonstrated this sewing technique a number of times now, and I have a video dedicated just to this sewing technique. However, I'm going to show enough detail so that this video is standalone, but I won't show sewing every single section. It's a bit hard to describe this sewing technique in words. You link up the sections with the section below at what would be the tape locations. I'll just rely on the video to help you understand how this linking is done, though it's not helped by the fact that I kept putting my hand in the way. So that's number 3 done. So number 4 will be the same technique, but over tapes, the same tapes as we used for number 2, so the 13mm cotton tape. It's just made a little bit trickier because often the needle gets caught in the tape. So that's number 4 almost done. After I did this one, I tipped on the folios for end papers for 3 and 4, but I forgot to hit the record button. But it's exactly the same as the first book. The final end paper configuration is a hooked folio. So you need a folio that's wider than the book, because you need this bit of extra for the hook. And just fold over 3 or 4 millimeters, and that will hook around the first and last sections. And once you have the end papers, it's a matter of punching the holes and sewing. I'm going to sew on the French sewing technique without tapes, and that is my preferred method when I'm binding books this way, which is usually manuals and catalogues. That's what I normally do. One little trick is that you really need to have that hook well around the section. It's very easy for it to not be aligned at the spine. As I just mentioned, this is my preferred way to do this binding, this sewing technique. However, for the video, I just wanted to show you what all the options were. But I think this one is a good compromise on speed and strength. So that's the 5 books done. The 6th book was sewn the same way that we just did and tipped on folios for end papers. So I won't bother showing you that. Now I'm going to cut the boards. So I'm going to cut these to roughly the same height as the text block and the same width. Actually, I'm going to do them 5 millimeters narrower than the text block because we're going to leave a 5 millimeter groove at the spine. I'll glue the spine of all the books with PVA. I'll knock them up quite firmly to the spine to make sure the sections are all aligned, and then just put a layer of PVA on them. I'll also trim the books with tapes so that the tapes are about a bit over an inch long, and I will glue the tapes down to the outer end paper. I'm going to leave a 5mm joint at the spine. Now I'm going to go through and mark all of these. It is a good idea to try and train your eye for 5mm. I've always struggled with 5mm. I'm good at 3mm. I think I'm good at 10mm, but 5 is a bit of a weakness for me, so I'm going to go through and mark 5mm on all of them, then glue out the outer sheet and pitch the cover boards to those lines and roll them down onto the book. I'm going to wrap the spine cloth 25mm around the spine on each side. That happens to be the width of my ruler, so I'm just going to go through and mark the boards with 25mm lines. I've cut a piece of cloth to the same height as the text block, and I'm going to use a scrap piece of the cloth to measure the distance around the spine. I use the cloth and then force it into the joint because it gives a closer measure to the amount of cloth that you need than using a piece of paper. The main trick to applying the spine cloth is to use your bone folder to work the cloth down into the joints as you wrap around the book. And do that 4 more times. So now it's smoko time, and I don't want the moisture of the adhesive getting into the text block, so I'm going to put moisture barriers in at the front and back of each of the books, which is also called a fence by bookbinders. And I think I leave this and come back to it the next day actually. So I'm going to cover the boards in craft paper, and I want to leave a 15mm strip of cloth at the spine. So I'm going to put 16mm on my dividers and put prick marks in, and then I will put the edge of the paper right on the prick marks so that the prick marks are hidden by the paper, So that will put the paper at about 15 millimeters. Now I'll glue out the board papers and apply them to the boards. Now I've put a label in each of the books which says what the book is, which volume it is, and I also put that at the head of the book so that I don't put the covers on upside down and that I get the right one on the right book. I've interleaved them with blotting paper and I'm going to let them dry under some light weight. I'll change the blotting paper a few times and that will help stop them warping. Now this one I want a 2mm square on the four edges. So I measured that by eye and trimmed it to give the 2mm squares. Now apply the paper and then wrap the paper around the fore-edge. And it's only got about 10mm of paper to wrap around, which is the instructions in Peter's paper. Now this little square at the fore-edge makes a huge difference to the feeling of the book. So this is my preferred variation, with a small fore-edge square with the board paper wrapped around the fore-edge. Now it's time to visit the guillotine. This is the cover of the copy that I downloaded off the internet, and there's my version of it. I hope you've enjoyed exploring this very practical binding with me today. I really appreciate the support that everyone shows through their comments and by hitting the big thumbs up button and by subscribing to the channel. Until next time, cheerio.